Hello, friends. This is Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy with Catholic Studies Academy. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our digital space where we explore the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition. Today, I am joined by my friend and former student, Mr. Whit Smith. Whit, feels like it's been a long time coming. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks
no
a
relation,
lot.
no relation, by the way, but
We know of
we know of. That's true. That's true. You never know.
Smiths in Tennessee. You never know.
That's true. That's true.
You know?
That's true. Mr. Smith is a Catholic entrepreneur, a dad, also a music producer, and I would say just sort of general Catholic provocateur. Does that sound about right?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, and also I met Whit, I had the good fortune of meeting Whit at Catholic College where I was teaching, and got to be friends with Whit as a student and then later as well. Today, we're going to talk about a great topic that I'm always interested in, which is philosophy and history. I think it's important to recognize and sort of engage with philosophy, both in sort of its abstract, sort of perennial forms, but also in terms of its sort of lived experience, concrete philosophy as we actually run into it in our lives, in our relationships, and in our society. And that, of course, history includes our own time, right? And I think especially in a time that so many of us find sort of confusing and sometimes downright alarming, it's important to kind of take a step back occasionally and say, hey, what's going on here? Where are we? Right. And this is a kind of exercise I've done a couple times in the past, with most recently, probably about a year ago. I did maybe a little longer than that one on what I called at the time, terrible name, postmodernism. It just sounds so terrible to say out of your mouth.
That's very postmodern of you to say that.
Right. Yeah, it even has a terrible shorter version is Popomo.
Yeah, you could just like see some continental philosophers in Zurich being like, "What do we call this?
What are we doing now?"
Postmodernism.
Right. That's right. Yeah, Popomo.
Yeah.
Anyways, so and I think there were some good things that came out of that conversation last time I explored it, but I kind of think things have changed, or maybe there's just things that I've become more aware of over the last, say, year to year and a half that I think I want to revise. So this is going to be an exploration in, what we could call zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Geist, is a great German word. It really probably closer to mind, but not in sort of the abstract sense that we usually think about, kind of mind sort of in the world doing things, right?
Right.
A very German kind
What
of
is
mind,
Zeit?
right?
What's Zeit mean? Do you
It's
know
like
what
of the
Zeit
age,
means?
time. Yeah.
The time ghost.
Yeah, the time mind, right? The
Yeah, the
time
time
mind.
mind.
Yeah, something like that.
Geist. Yeah.
So, I want to kind of, I think it's a good way of approaching this is to talk a little bit about my own engagement with postmodernism, because I'm titling this episode After Postmodernism, which kind of gives away kind of a little bit of where I think we are. When I was studying undergraduate and graduate philosophy, postmodernism was, I think, in its sort of heyday, right? It had its greatest effect. Myself, I'm a Gen Xer. A lot of my colleagues were Gen Xers. This was kind of the philosophy for us, right? We were kind of skeptical, kind of cynical. We weren't going to sort of buy into any institutions.
It was the 90s.
That's right. Yeah. It was the 90s. It was also fun. I will say that about it. Like, we were skeptical, but we weren't boring. We were actually sort of skeptical and had a good time. We got well, nothing really matters, so let's at least have a good time, right?
Right.
Which whatever. There you go. Every age has its particular sins, right?
Right.
So it was at its heyday there, and then of course I was becoming Catholic at this point, and sort of kind of doubling down on the conservatism that I had been raised with, but now sort of kind of elevated and enriched with sort of Catholic tradition and classical philosophy. Right. And so I was sort of pivoting against that in a lot of ways. against postmodernism, at least in a lot of, some ways philosophically. And, sort of saw a lot of my own work as combating the kind of skepticism, right, and the critiques of reason that you would find in postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
But time goes on, and I think that period, has sort of like, we've left that behind. I don't think that we're in the same period in terms of postmodernism. Let me give a couple of examples that I think are helpful. But for example, I had one professor where I went to college, which I would say at the time was a very just sort of center, middle of the road kind of college. It wasn't radically left. It wasn't by any means super conservative. It was just kind of right in the middle, right?
Right.
And you went to the same college for a little while, right? And I had a professor there though who was a Marxist, which is kind of crazy to say, but there she was. Like, she confessed to being a Marxist, right?
A confessing Marxist.
A confessing Marxist. That's right. Yeah. And one of her interests was intellectual history, and she had an emphasis on the idea that kind of a Marxist critique of science, right? Which is kind of interesting, right? That is, that science is a form of privilege and power and hierarchy that privileges sort of a white male logocentric kind of perspective over other perspectives, right? And so that really was just a kind of a discourse of power that needed to be, if not displaced, at least undermined, right? And
or viewed with a bit of skepticism.
That's right. Viewed with skepticism. That's right.
Yeah.
And so even with the Enlightenment, right, which I tend to sort of think of Marx kind of as an Enlightenment kind of guy in an odd sort of way. Certainly, Marx thought of himself as being scientific, right? He thought his own work was scientifically rigorous. It was Trotsky, right, who more put it in a kind of ethical and aesthetic and moral and cultural sort of tone, right?
Good old Trotsky.
Yeah, that's right. The losers, right?
Yeah.
They didn't win. Right.
Trotsky the vanquished.
That's right. But anyways, so that's just one insight. Another is that we were reading people like let's see here. There's a guy named Feyerabend. There was that a lot of us read. Kuhn was very important. He was the Paradigms of Scientific Revolution. There was Richard Rorty in the American scene, who sort of did a kind of a postmodern pragmatism. He was a left winger who liked to use terms like ethnocentric democracy, which was really interesting, right?
That's very interesting.
Yeah. His arguments were like, we can't really prove that the Nazis were wrong, but if you come and live in America, you'll like it better. Right.
For now,
right? Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. He called it that was his argument for our democratic faith. But he admitted, right, that there was no skyhook, as he liked to put it all the time, by which we could ground our judgments in a sort of transcendent, permanent, or universal perspective. That our judgments are always perspectival, sort of conditioned by particular culture and all that sort of stuff, right? So anyways,
so that was his skyhook.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So that's kind of the decade in which I was being philosophically informed. Now I was reading a lot of other stuff too. I was doing a lot of Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, all that as the antidote, right?
Right.
But as I've said, I think our culture's moved on. What were you gonna say? What?
No, I was just gonna say, reading Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and living in postmodern land, it's jarring.
It is jarring. Right.
That's why I'm Catholic.
That's
okay.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, I rolled up to your class and it was a thoroughgoing Marxist libertine, and I was like, and y'all are talking about virtue ethics and objective truth and right living and all of these things, and I was just like, whoa, okay, so there's actual like philosophic underpinnings to my mom scolding me for sneaking out at night.
That's
Got
right.
it. Okay.
That's right.
All right. All right.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it is kind of bracing and sort of exhilarating, right? When you're sort of because you are really doing something really sort of different, right?
Yep.
And setting out in a totally different trajectory. And it's exciting, I think, when you, I mean, to some degree, it's exciting when you think everything is being deconstructed and they're like, no, actually, there is a different way of thinking. We don't have to be cynical and indifferent to everything, right?
Right.
There are actually
Right.
things worthy of my commitment and fidelity.
It's like like watching Clerks say when you first get to your parents' house for Christmas, and then on Christmas Day you watch It's a Wonderful Life, and you're like, maybe it is good to have Christmas cheer. Like maybe that's all right to.
That's right. That's right.
Maybe this holiday is cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, but as I say, time moved on, and it seems to be more and more, and I've talked about this, that the critique of science has just completely faded. And I think this is very closely allied with maybe various political moments and developments around things like maybe COVID, and then also around environmentalism, right?
Right.
And maybe a couple of other topics that are coming to mind, but those two come to mind, where certain political movements latch onto science in order to advance specific, say, public health agenda or environmental agenda, right?
Right.
And so all of a sudden, right, when I'm thinking, I'm still sort of like kind of thinking in the 90s and maybe early aughts of a criticism of science, and science is sort of over here, right? Actually, it's being sort of re-embraced, right? In a lot of ways by the culture. And probably especially the other one that jumps out, of course, is evolution versus creation in sort of our American religious dialectic, right?
Right.
So those things come. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say the scientism. I think there's been an undercurrent of scientism since the genesis of the scientific revolution, if you will.
Sure.
But it crops its head up.
Yeah.
Because you had the Malthusianism that was saying, oh, we got these useless eaters everywhere, and we've got to get the population down, and then it flitted to another thing, and then in the 70s you had the population bomb book come out, and so there's like periodic kind of scientism. I don't know what is it, scientismistic.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
I don't know. Like epochs that come around periodically, and right now with COVID, on the tail end of COVID, and they're trying to mask again, by the way. They're trying to.
I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, at least not in Tennessee.
I don't think so.
So, but yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like, I think in the 90s, from what I gather, I mean, I was younger in the 90s, but the Gen X, like healthy criticism of like the scientific intelligentsia, like that's gone now, like you said. But I think if you were to press somebody in the 90s about, say, evolution, they'd be like, nah, I mean, like that's scientific. I mean, I don't know how deep the Gen X critique would go on evolution outside of someone, say, like Sarah from Rose, or somebody like in that camp.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it kind of depended, I think, who you were talking to. I mean, Derrida later in his career tried to back off some of the stronger things he said early on, as people do, right? And Foucault is sort of similar.
Woo!
I mean, these are pretty heavy hitters, and we're pretty serious about really thinking of science as one narrative among others, and particularly, again, early on, a Western narrative that had that really was adjacent to imperialism, and so a lot of this was a white versus brown, right?
Of course,
sort of situation, right? And so science in that period of critique, right? Maintaining folkways and folk understandings was very important, right? Because it was a sign of and a way of being anti-imperialist.
Yeah, and now the irony is the imperial urge has not abated among these proponents of scientism. In fact, the fervor is heavier than ever. And the most annoying part of it is that they love to say folks. Have you ever noticed this? They're like, well, folks, the folks are, they're without access to these masks or
That's
whatever.
right.
They
That's
love to
right.
say that, and they're the least likely people to know folks.
That's
Okay,
right.
but they
That's
love to
right.
say it.
They love to say
They
it. That's
love it.
true.
Yeah.
That's true. And there is a kind of sort of um, paternalism there, right? Like if they just had access to what
Right.
we had access to, then of course they would do what we're telling them to do,
Right. If
like
they
good
just
men.
had my terrible, productive, middle class dad in the suburbs who I
Right.
don't
That's
like,
right. That's
then
right.
maybe they too could say folks.
That's right. In
You
the
know,
same way,
yeah,
one
yeah.
other moment of scientism that's often forgotten, right, is early 20th century and late 19th century social evolutionary theory and eugenics, right? Which, I mean,
Yeah.
those are like, that was considered fairly scientific. I think Herbert Spencer being sort of like one of the real, proponents beating the drum, but he
Right.
was pretty much like, look, there's higher and lower in the species,
Right.
and we just need to let the competition for resources play itself out and let the weaker fall behind, the stronger ascend. Right.
Right. And that's totally gone.
That's right. That's right. Now, but that
It's
was
totally
considered
gone.
scientific, right? At the
Of course.
time, right? Which
Yeah.
is really interesting, right? It's all those who invoke, they're like, do you like eugenics, right?
Yeah.
Do you think
They
we
love
should?
Darwinism. They love to think that we came from the goop at the bottom of the lake
Right.
and emerged like the swamp thing. And then they apply it. They're like, oh yeah, I love Shark Week. I love to watch the Yellowstone documentary. We need to bring the wolves back. And all, we're just terrible apex, parasitic species. And
Right.
then the minute you talk about, human uh,
Hierarchies.
hierarchies, they're like, well, I mean, that doesn't obtain,
Yeah,
that
that's
doesn't,
right. What are you
that's,
talking about?
or they're just like, we'll never talk about that
That's
ever.
right. Right. I
Meanwhile,
don't
they're
know what
like
you're
going
talking
home.
about.
They're going home from their praxis party and like gossiping about how somebody's an idiot.
That's
You know,
right.
like
That's
like he's
right.
just an idiot. I don't know. He broke up with that girl and he's just dumb. And you're like, well, I thought you. Well, so you're on top. Got
That's
it.
right.
Okay.
That's right. That's right.
Now,
So I think what I've been interested to see is the emergence of really a new worldview, right? In which you have, I think, on one side, scientism, uh, physicalism, right? So I would say a great number of people today, when I ask questions that are I think properly metaphysical in nature, would just say, well, look, science has the answer to that question. So when I say, metaphysics is the rational investigation of what is real or reality, the response can be, well, just go look at your physics book, and that physics and chemistry will tell you what you need to know there.
yeah. Meanwhile, they used Cliff Notes.
That's right.
And that no one reads the textbook. Like they haven't read the textbook. Okay. They
Mm-hmm,
don't,
mm-hmm.
they're like, well, it's science. And you're like, what? And there's a Chesterton quote that I love to quote him, but there's
Mm-hmm.
one that's appropriate for this. He talks about how there's like this kind of listless, this is back in the 20s, like this listless group of people, this strata of intelligentsia who, um, they'll like casually cite something that they read in a newspaper
Mm-hmm,
and then
mm-hmm.
just uncritically just be like, oh yeah, no, I mean, I heard they found that in the Galapagos Islands or whatever. Now, I mean, yeah. So anyway, and you're like, wait, what? And they're like, yeah.
Right.
So that's the newest thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
right.
the
Yeah.
newest thing. I've been
It's
imparted by the priestly class, and you're
sure,
like,
sure.
what?
So this is a classic example, right, of the midwit, right? Who
Yes.
is just has enough intelligence to kind of be told things that
Yes.
higher intellects know, maybe, right? So
Right.
so like a fun one with this, is just like shifts in Civil War histography, right? So like
Mm.
everybody has picked up on, okay, well, we can't, we have one narrative here that we're allowed to say, right? And
Right.
they get maybe 2 or 3 little factoids about that,
Mm.
and they
Mm.
learn to repeat them, and
Yes.
they read it in the Atlantic, right, or something
Yep.
like that, right?
No.
Uh,
Someone told them what they read in the Atlantic.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Maybe they picked it up on Twitter or X now, right?
Yeah. X,
Whatever.
sure. I
And
reject Elon Musk's brand nominalism.
I,
Yeah.
yeah, you're the funny
Talk
thing.
about S. Talk about essence and accident. Essence and accident. The essence of X is Twitter. Okay.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. I
Yeah.
yeah, it's funny. I have no particular interest or affection or engagement with Twitter. Over the many years it's existed, until I heard about it renaming it X, and I thought that was pretty funny. I was like, "What are you doing?" Like it's
Yeah. That's the most Gen X thing Elon Musk has
that's
ever done.
right. Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, yeah. So I think such people really are, like you say, just kind of repeating, right?
Right.
Um, but that has a sort of a mimetic force and has a sort of cultural force to it, right? When that's happening. So maybe they don't understand it deeply, and maybe they don't care to. I just recently brought up the idea of, okay, well, let's, in one of my classes where I was adjunct teaching, and I said, kind of gave a description of, well, maybe this is how human behavior, we should explain human behavior strictly in terms of physiological prior states.
Right.
And, I was like, that's a kind of scientific, we talk about chemistry, we talk about physics and that kind of
Right.
thing. And then I said, what that means then, of course, is that none of us really choose anything, right? There's no such thing really as choosing. There's just,
Oh, sure.
like there's no freedom, right? And you're not responsible for what you do, and neither is anyone else, right?
Right.
And it was like, oh, wait a second, it means that, right? Yeah, actually, if there's nothing outside of that causal net, then yeah, it does mean that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so probably poorly thought through, of course, right?
Yeah. If I may, I was just thinking about, there's that wonderful meme template, which is the moron, midwit, monk,
Sure, yes,
IQ bell curve meme.
yeah, that's
If
great.
I may, if I may give a defense of the midwit,
Okay.
okay, this is going to be contrarian,
Uh,
but all right. So we talk about human hierarchies, right?
mhm.
And I believe there's human hierarchies in ability, it's
Sure.
in particular. Um, and I like, so this is why good governance and
Right.
good civic culture is important,
Hmm.
because if you have these basically like radio repeaters who are giving factoid, who are just blasting factoids along the way in a conversation about
Hmm.
whatever, in order to maintain the kind of you know globally homogenous regime, in short,
Right.
globo homo, okay, talking points, uh, that I think that's never going to go away.
Sure.
And I think that given the literacy rates and the technology proliferation in the Western world, it's only going to grow. That class is only going to grow larger.
Hmm.
And I think I think it's fine if they're getting right info.
That's
You know what
true.
I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. Sure.
If the like monk guys are actually wise, and
Hmm.
they're like, "Whoa, well, you mustn't you mustn't work on the Sabbath, haven't you heard?"
Right. Right.
You're
Right.
like I'd be fine with that.
Sure.
Or
Sure.
like, I heard
Sure.
in the Bible that it said that, and they're right. Okay,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know.
Right. Right. No, I think that's true. I think even in a classical model, right? What you might say, is that the gentleman doesn't need to be the philosopher, right?
Right,
The gentleman needs to be the knight, the officer, the lord, right? That sort of
right,
person, right? Who does a good job of taking care of people and making things happen,
right,
and makes sure that the right things happen, right? Because he's learned what the right things are, right?
right.
From, we'll just say, maybe the Guardians or
Sure.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, something along those lines, right?
Like, I don't want to get pulled over by a cop and have him be like, "Well, I was actually pondering whether your car was a phantasm
That's
of my
right.
mind." Okay, I want to
Sure.
be like, "You just violated section, Tennessee annotated code
Right. That's right.
347. You merged
Hmm.
without a blinker." I don't want
Hmm.
everyone walking around, having their philosophical underpinnings. Like, I mean, that'd be great if they had it like ready to be like, "Well, this is why I pulled you over." and like
Right. Yeah.
law is good, and I'm a blessed are the peacemakers, and like
Uh-huh.
all that. That's great if they understand that, but that's not really. I don't think it's necessary for everyone to walk around being or pretending to be philosopher kings. I
Sure.
mean, I
Yeah.
certainly don't.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
I maybe
agree.
pretend to be a philosopher king, and
Sure.
that's why my wife gets annoyed at me.
Right. Yeah, you only need so many after all.
Yeah,
But I mean, we'll come back to this question about the midwit, because I do think there's something particularly vicious about midwittery in
sure,
our current
sure.
setup. But we'll come back
There
to it in a
certainly
minute.
is. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The so the other side of this, so right, we have kind of like this, I would call it almost a faith in science. Not that
Mm-hmm.
science is a faith or if science is a religion or something like that. I don't want to go down that's not what I mean. What I mean is that more than thinking about science as an effective form of inquiry, right, which
Right.
it is an effective form of inquiry within certain domains, instead of thinking about it in those terms, right, it's really like we need to believe that science can fix our lives, right?
Yeah.
Science so it's a kind of normative, ethical, practical faith, right? I trust science
Mm-hmm.
to deliver me the kind of life and society that I want,
Right. Mm-hmm.
instead of atomic bombs or viruses that will destroy the world.
Right.
That's another
Yeah. They
narrative about
love the
science too,
science.
right?
Yeah. They love
That's
the
the
science.
Frankenstein side.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, they love the science until one of their acolytes leaks it from a lab.
That's right. That's right. That's why you can't say that that's what it was. That was not the origin. Wasn't
No, it
origin.
was
Couldn't
pangolin
be.
soup. It was pangolin soup. My kids, when COVID first hit, they're like, "Daddy, what happened?" I was like, "Those dastardly Chinese." Okay, the
Mm-hmm.
Chinese government they unleashed some sort of strange virus, and
Right.
it likely came from a lab, but everyone's saying that it maybe came from a wet market, which is like they eat bats. And my children were appalled because they're Western, and they're
Sure.
like, they
Sure.
eat bats. So we talk about Chinese food like 6 months later, and my middle daughter, she goes, "Oh no, you can't eat that. You'll get COVID." And I'm like, that's what they want you to think, that it
That's
came from a
right.
wet market. I mean, Jon
Yeah.
Stewart went on Colbert.
Uh,
Jon Stewart, for all of his foibles, he went on
sure.
Colbert. I think it was in 2020, and the debate was raging on where this thing came from and all that. And he's like, I don't know, maybe it came from the Wuhan coronavirus lab that's in Wuhan, China. He's like, if there was an outbreak of chocolatey goodness in Hershey, Pennsylvania, what would you say?
That's
Maybe it
right.
came from the Hershey's factory.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So and Colbert was flustered because it was, he's fully locked into this like agnostic, whoa, we don't really know. It could have been their delicacies that, were
Mm,
undercooked or whatever.
right.
And Jon Stewart's just like, no,
Yeah,
I think
like
it came from
what's the
the
more
that lab.
likely? What's the clearer hypothesis, right? And
Right.
like the lab where they make this kind of stuff.
Yeah, the lab where they make it. And by the way, China, I mean, everyone's like, oh, China's going to take over the world, and they have us in a chokehold in many respects. But if you look, there's some wonderful compilation videos on TikTok of like Chinese bridges collapsing, and it's just
Mm.
like, guys, their lab exit protocol. Remember, they are communists. Like it's not like, so. Yeah, he didn't wash his hands well enough, or like didn't
Sure.
delouse himself when he got out of the thing. So yeah, whoever did it,
Yeah, gotcha.
but they don't want
Uh,
to talk about that.
no, because they
They
have
just want
faith in
to,
science,
yeah,
right?
and they just want to fund it. They're like, well, that's, you got to break a few eggs. Got to
That's
crack a few
right.
eggs to make an omelet or whatever.
Sure. And let's put the emphasis on people, not where it came from, but sort of people who don't want to wear a mask or something like that, right? Let's distract
Absolutely,
from.
it's like the tertiary good that they then, which in so much sin is elevating a lower good above a greater good.
Sure.
So they come in and they're just hammering. They turn around and put the angst that should be towards the Chinese government, right?
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Like in a
And the lab,
well-ordered,
right? Yeah.
yeah, in a lab, like what happened here? We're going to sanction China. Like, no, they're sanctioning me.
That's right. That's right.
For
That's
not
right.
wearing your 5-cent dental hygienist mask.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
On an airplane.
Yeah, and like sort of just sort of shaming some group of Baptists for getting together to sing hymns. It's it's COVID, you're killing people.
Yeah, you can't sing. I mean, I think that was one of the more diabolic aspects of the whole COVID thing. They literally said, like, don't sing
in church.
What? Yeah, in church.
Right.
It's a super spreader event. You mean what? Of the gospel and joy?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
All right. Yeah.
So the other side of this, right? So there's this kind of faith in science. Now, what's really interesting is this is, right, a pre-postmodern view. That is, it's a modern view. It's an Enlightenment view.
Right. And then, which I think shows their colors when things are tough. I think they just, because they could talk about how nothing's real and relativism, and we came from nothing, which we did, ex nihilo, but not in the way they think. And right. It's like, Goop. But like, we came from nothing, we are nothing, we're parasitic, maladaptive creatures on the planet. Oh, but if like I'm gonna die, if I don't choose to euthanize myself beforehand, if I'm gonna die from something perilous, they immediately fall back, I think, on the framework, on the blueprint of this kind of Enlightenment thinking, yes, where they immediately are triumphal over, the backwards religious people or whatever. And then of course it just tees up wonderfully, because when your uncle's on Facebook and he's like, I'm not getting the vaccine, and or whatever, and God bless, and he's posting like really like poorly edited, like like Jesus on with his hand on Trump's shoulder or whatever, you know what I mean? It's just like and you're sitting and his nephew's sitting in the urban core going, I mean, we're all gonna die here because of this idiot who lives in an area with a population density of 50 per square mile. It's
which
like,
it's what? Actually right. Yeah, almost completely harmless, right? So yeah, I think you're totally right. It does all sort of converge, right, with a certain momentum there, and I think it kind of reveals the hand, and part of that hand is the conquest of nature. We don't use that terminology anymore, right?
No, of course not.
In fact, we, on the environmentalist side, sort of have a kind of almost, romantic kind of adoration of nature or something.
At this point, dare say pagan.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, worship. Yeah. I don't know. They're worshiping. Yeah.
Yeah. But not our own nature, of course. That's that we don't have a nature, which is really interesting. We're the natureless animal. But really, the conquest of nature is a part of the Enlightenment ideal, right? And that we can overcome all these natural limitations, natural orders, natural inclinations with a rational organization, right, of both our knowledge and of society, right?
Right.
So that's always back there, right? And I think, again, comes through at certain times. Along with that, then, is something else that I hadn't really sort of paid attention to. Again, thinking sort of things in a postmodern paradigm, I tended to think that ethical questions were one of those sets of questions that we still were basically thought were all subjective. Mm-hmm. We've cited here one belief, moral belief, you could say, that they have, right? That is the trust and belief in science, that is ethical. But I think sort of behind that is the view that the most important thing is aggregate human satisfaction, and the worst evil is aggregate human suffering, right? And that the maximization of satisfaction and the minimization of human suffering is actually kind of is actually the moral imperative, right?
Unless it's Congolese children in lithium mines.
Well,
because they're like, what I'm trying to say is that they're on their phones and they're driving around in the plug-in hybrid or whatever, and they're and maybe that's the backdrop. And I think that's the most frustrating thing about even their own framework, is that when pressed, you're like, yeah, but like the Congolese mine, like literal miners
Yeah.
are slaving away in the mud, getting lithium all over their feet, with nothing to eat. And you like bring that up, which is a very 90s thing
Sure.
to bring up. And to
Right.
your point earlier, like they don't care. They're
Yeah.
like, no, because I think, yes, aggregate human suffering is something that they're opposed to, and aggregate human comfort or whatever is something to is something to strive for. But they, instead of like saying, "Oh wow, look at all the technology we've produced over the last 100 years. What a wonderful thing! We have antibiotics, the MRI machine. We can get a
Mm.
car we can summon a car in the Target parking lot to come
Mm-hmm.
pick us up." And instead of that, they loathe talking to their grandpa at Thanksgiving, who's like, "Yeah, back in my day, it sucked." They're not like, "I know, and isn't it wonderful? Like what it's like now. I'm so
Mhm.
sorry that was like that." Like, whatever, man.
Right.
There's
Uh-huh.
nothing to learn from you
Sure.
because you were part of the problem because you didn't have a time machine to have my brain in the
That's right. Yeah.
1940s.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
sneer. It's a sneering kind of thing.
It is. It is. I think there's something tied into that, though, right? Um, is It's very instructive to go back and read. I don't remember exactly when it came out. It was maybe the late 50s or early 60s. This sounds so corny even to say, but the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
That doesn't sound corny. It sounds like something I'd see in a meme. Yeah.
You like the UN, right? That includes like all of these sort of like North Korea and all these
Mm-hmm.
places, But anyways, so
Mm-hmm.
the something very interesting in there, right, is this insistence. Of course, this is the great narrative of the 20th century is the overcoming of racism, the
Of
overcoming of
course.
Nazism, the overcome and coming to terms with the Holocaust, right?
Of course.
We understand ourselves, right? A lot of people understand themselves and society in America and the West and the rest of the world within that sort of structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the Declaration of Human Rights talks very stridently about the inherent dignity of every human person and the equal dignity of every human person, right? Such that all of them have equal rights that they will not be deprived of unnecessarily or without due process or something of that nature. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it is interesting that inherent dignity and inherent quality, that sort of thing, seems to kind of ground it. So, thinking about past generations, right, and the dismissal,
Right.
the sneer you were talking about, those past generations, because they did not recognize this,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is, I think, the narrative. Because they did not recognize this, they cause unjustifiable suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And are worthy of the sneer.
They're worthy of derision.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Because of their lack of recognizing dignity and causing suffering. And so for that reason, they're sneer worthy, right? And,
Right.
and that same goes for deplorables today.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's why they can, you can sneer at them. I think I shared with you yesterday, there was a meme that somebody posted on Facebook, along the lines of, it's a 1950s advertisement. I don't know what it originally would have said, but it had sort of a nice, caring nurse, sort of helping, ministering to a young child young girl in the hospital. And in the balloon, sort of dialogue balloon, there was the words, "Oh, I'm sorry, honey, this is Tennessee, and you have to keep your daddy's baby," right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, God, like
Mm-hmm.
okay, what's going on there, right? This is
Yeah.
a criticism of Tennessee for having callous and indifferent to suffering abortion laws, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Our abortion laws cause suffering and therefore are bad.
Right. Well, a point of note: the left can't meme. like the terrible mean. So like
it's kind of heavy-handed, right?
yeah, okay,
It's
they
not
can't
funny.
meme, number one. And yeah, what they didn't put in there, which would have made it actually what you could do to make it funny, is that behind her hand, like she's got her hands behind her back, she's got a brochure for how to cut your breasts off. Right, like you should cut your breasts off too, if you feel like it, or whatever. I don't know. Here's some propaganda, and
right.
I've got a wonderful thruple that you should meet that could help guide you with mindfulness on how to deal with your state enforced suffering. So that's the thing. They're like, oh, well, we got this. In fact, our mayoral candidate, one of our mayoral candidates, in a recent debate here in Nashville, called Tennessee a forced birth state, like from the podium.
Yeah.
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 And so you're right. They're operating on this, and yet they're not cognizant of the technocratic like biological atrocities that will not be looked on favorably. They'll be looked on probably like eugenics at some point, and it will be, but it will be memory hold and swept under the rug, and no one will know about it and all that. So while they are concerned with alleviating aggregate human suffering, it's on their terms, and their terms change every decade.
It's true.
Every single decade.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I mean,
and it's kind of
right.
like the suffering for who, right? Because you could see, right, that there is like this other side of suffering that's caused. But I think there's just a straightforward denial. I mean, I think what the riposte with is, you're just incorrect. These surgeries diminish human suffering.
Right.
They increase satisfaction because they allow these children to experience their true identity, right? And it's so that that's an argument of fact, right? Or claim about facts, right?
Sure.
And this is where, of course, I mean, I think in a certain sense you have to say satisfaction's not a sufficient criteria for action. Right?
No.
And neither is displeasure, right?
Well, I mean,
it's kind of infantile. And it brings to mind, and this is, I think, important. We've picked up this way of thinking. And I don't think it's completely accidental. And I think it's ultimately kind of infantile. In the little book I wrote about modern political ideas, I talk about utilitarianism as the reign of feelings, right? And feelings and numbers, as if you could turn thank you, as if you could turn over your life to numbers and feelings, and if you could quantify your feelings just the right way. I mean, doesn't this sound infantile, right? I mean, just quantify your positive feelings, negative feelings, right? And sort of like weigh it all out. That's the way you should go, right? And that is kind of where I think we are. And I hate to do this, but it does remind me of Huxley's Brave New World, right? I mean, that there is this kind of like making infantile, I'm not sure how to say it, of human beings, such that I really can't. I think I don't know that this is entirely true, but it's hard, I think, for a lot of modern humans to act on motivations other than satisfaction right now. Like saying to somebody, it's your duty, stop it. It's dishonorable.
If you said it,
for you to do X.
That, well, I think
you'll shame your family for doing that. Like,
but that's the whole thing, is that their lineage is depraved. In their paradigm, their lineage is brave.
Right. Yeah.
And so, and to the point earlier about the leftist meme that, and they can't meme again. I want to remind the listeners, though, that idea, right? Like, well, I'm so sorry, in this state you have to keep your daddy's baby, right? They will then turn around and deride like right-wing voters, conservative voters in the hinterlands as being incestuous backwoods, yokels whom they would probably be fine with. They're like, they'd love for her to abort. They wish that person was aborted. They don't want those people around. So it's like, that's like the kind of weaponized like little flash of populism or whatever that they
Sure.
will then they'll be like, well, no, folks, access to abortion health care in Clay County or
Well, look, I mean,
whatever.
isn't that? I mean, the truth is, I mean, we know about Margaret Sanger's racist background, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we know that like abortion was meant to cull certain populations, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I mean, that's terrible to say, but
Right.
it's just the truth, right? I mean,
Right.
I don't, right?
It's the truth.
Right. But
Yeah, and I know it's instead of saying like instead of making a meme about going to find that dad and like lynching him or
sure, right,
something,
yeah,
that like
yeah.
they're like, yeah, in this state, there's the state's so evil.
That's
How about we
right.
go take care
Kill
of the
the guy,
dad? Yeah, how about we
right?
just kill the guy? I mean, what
Right. Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah. I
There's no
agree.
memes about like the bad guy. It's all
Hmm.
about the proximate bad guy.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
The
Yeah,
failed solution, right?
right.
That sort of thing. I mean, obviously, criminal justice. This comes up all the time, right?
Of course.
That nobody cares about just punishing the criminal, right? It's like
Well,
no,
unless
actually,
they do, unless they do,
unless they do, right? Unless
unless they do.
there are some individuals, right? Again,
Yeah,
worthy of the sneer and worthy of punishment, but for the
yeah.
most part, right? They just kind of want to do something else. So, I mean, I think the extreme of this. I mean, the one area where I see this come out all the time is the discussions about homelessness, right?
Mhm.
And it drives me a little crazy. There are these people who are public advocates for the homeless
Mhm.
who advocate for them to remain in crap conditions and that they
Yes.
should be left alone. And I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I love the
Mhm.
homeless too much
Mhm.
to say we should just leave them alone and turn over sections of our cities to criminality and drug abuse and self-destruction, right? I mean, that's all
Right.
that is,
Well, Dr. Smith, the only reason they're in squalor now is because the city council can't dredge up the funds to do housing first solutions, right? Because these people are just like me.
Right, yeah.
They just are down on their luck and they're
Mhm.
just like me. Never mind that we basically banned the insane asylums back in the
Mhm.
70s based on a spurious paper by a Berkeley psychologist who literally fabricated his work
Wow.
in his published paper.
Yeah.
And never the mind that like they're all on mental health probation and they burned every bridge in their life and they're mentally ill or they have demonic attacks happening all the time or whatever. No, I mean that they want it to they first of all they don't live there. They don't live near that,
Sure.
and probably very few of them have people who have in their family, network or whatever who have become homeless. And so they're like, yeah, just leave them on the street and they have a right to the sidewalk and it's fine that they're just like living next to the Lowe's and walking around naked in West Nashville and all that. I mean, that's what I saw a naked dude outside of Lowe's. There was a huge
Yeah.
camp there, and there was a huge outcry when they cleared out the park because they're like, well, they're living in the woods and it's like Mad Max in there, but it's romantic and it's so
How's it
sad and
romantic?
it's so
That's
sad at the same time. Like, I mean, like I had a friend who back when I was left wing, and when I came out on the internet as a conservative,
uh,
this woman tried to like smear me as using like a racist caricature accent when I was reading some poetry, and I was like, and she loved to take pictures of like working class whites out
mhm.
in the hinterlands and was like, oh look, they're like smoking Pall Malls and it's the folks, right? But
Uh,
if you sat down and were like, okay, here's what I think of you, and here's what it's like total detachment.
right,
They'll take the homeless for instance and go, well, we must do something about this,
right, right.
and then they don't, they've taken, I mean, because let's be real, I've worked with people who are near homeless for 5 years, and they don't really understand because they don't know these people. They don't really get it.
Sure. Yeah.
I've encountered probably hundreds of them personally in my life. Like,
yeah, it's sort of like projecting.
Yeah,
it's sort of like projecting. Like, well, how would it be that I was in this situation? And then you come up with a sort of a tragic tale. And of course, I mean, we would all concede that, of course, there are tragic tales, right?
Sure.
That happens, and wherever it does happen, we should try to ameliorate that.
Mm-hmm.
But ameliorate that means like not letting it be homeless anymore.
Like maybe
like I want to fix homelessness. I don't want to accommodate it. You know what I mean?
Right.
I want to overcome this problem, right?
Right. And then they would say, but in devil's advocate, they would say, but Dr. Smith, we do too. But because because the state of Tennessee is beholden to the Koch brothers and to the NRA, and we're more concerned about, arming our teachers or whatever, we have no legislative bandwidth for the housing first solution, where we just put them in houses.
Just put them in housing,
just put them in tiny houses. Yeah, they'll live in the pod, they'll eat the bugs, all that. We're going to vax them up and put them in there. Like, guys, they aren't like, they have problems.
Sure,
these guys have problems, and it's sad. People think I'm callous or whatever. Whenever I see a homeless person, I think of them as a little child, like, and I'm like, wow, like, because I've got kids, and I'm like, man, that would be such a bummer for my own children to become homeless and like live on the street. That'd be so terrible.
Right.
And so, like, it's all these like technocratic solutions without charity. And I think that's, at the end of the day, what's happening is the Catholic Church has posited labor. They've commented on almost everything: labor, gender, homelessness, whatever it is. And by and large, it's been competent responses that are common sense on how we should view these things and what we should do about them. And what the postmodern culturati and intelligentsia do is they divorce the charity from these solutions. And so, of course, they can't even agree on what like the best end is. So say with homelessness, it's housing first. Okay.
Right.
All right. Where do we put them? Where are the houses? Who's building them? And what do we do about it once we get the houses up?
Yeah.
They're just like, well, I mean, we just like to say that we just are just going to say that. And you're like, well, what's the charitable thing to do?
Right.
And they're like, what? They're like, what? This isn't a charity. You're like, no, no, love. What's the loving thing to do?
Right.
It's all divorced. It's all divorce charity. And that's why it's bad. That's why it's perverse.
Sure. Well, this is an interesting point. You bring this back to the question of love and charity. And we could kind of maybe start to wrap up here. But I think, see, I think they would say they're being loving, but they, of course, have an underdeveloped understanding of love, right? And it's a kind of love that is like their view of love is egalitarian, right? Love is love, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? And we love everyone equally, which, of course, is not rational or good, right? You should
just,
you should love your wife more than other women. You should love your children more than other children.
Your partner. Yeah,
that's right. You're right. You should love your own country more than other countries. All that sort of stuff, right? That doesn't mean you don't love other countries. You just love your own more, right? So it's just a little distinction there, right? More or less, right?
Yeah.
But so there's the egalitarianism that confuses them, and they mistake a sentiment for an act of the will.
Yes.
The sentiment, right? So it's got to be equal, and it's a feeling. So I equally have the feeling of affirming all of these different lifestyles, social positions, kinds of relationships, activities, regardless of the underlying content, right? That is contemporary. That's what their love is, right? So, it's that feeling of affirmation, right? Whereas, true love, right, is intending and choosing the good for a person.
Correct.
Right. Now, hopefully, often that will be accompanied by appropriate feeling. That's the best scenario, right? Where they don't need to be robots. But you notice what's basic there and what's defining and distinguishing is the good, right? I like to, love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth, right?
Right.
In the New Testament, right? So you're not loving when you will homelessness to someone or approve of it. That's not loving. That's the opposite. Human shelter, even in their own terminology, human shelter is a basic right.
Sure.
And so what we should be wanting is to, because I love you, I insist on you not being homeless. Right.
Yeah.
And we're going to do the things that prevent that homelessness. Right. And those might be things that are painful at the level of sentiment, but are good at the level of human development. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think that you're spot on. The big rub with all that, though, is it's kind of like the Martha's Vineyard immigrant thing, where some governors flew illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, or maybe
illegal aliens.
Pardon me, undocumented persons of indeterminate gender.
Why they keep calling it the migrants? That always makes me think of like birds.
Yeah,
something. They just kind of migrate through the earth.
They're undocumented migrants of indeterminate gender, and when they flew them up there, that was a brilliant move, because it's when it's in your backyard. You're like, they move. These people move and they self-segregate, and because biology's strong, and we don't talk. The herd mentality and the mimetic quality of the human mind, and the how things are parroted and repeated throughout society. I mean, that's just, a lot of the stuff is natural. It's the problem is that the good as defined isn't good. And I don't know. I think it was C.S. Lewis in the Screw Tape Letters, where he has one of the demons is talking to the other demon. He's like, all right, so you're assigned guy. Get him to love humanity.
That's
right. If he loves humanity, won't love his neighbor.
That's right.
And so, this whole idea of slacktivism, right? And I think that most people are just slacktivists. They don't want to, like, they'd be appalled at actually speaking with a homeless person. They're terrified. They don't want to go do the work. I mean, you have this kind of like Dorothy Day leftover kind of sentiment still, where it's like, we got to get down and dirty with the homeless or whatever it is, illiteracy or whatever. You just don't see people going out and volunteering, putting their money where their mouth is. And that's endemic to the right and to the Catholic world as well. I just think people are lazy, and I think that they want to parrot these current postmodern thing, and they don't want to actually put their boots on the ground and go do the thing. They don't want to house homeless people. It's dangerous. They don't want to do that. But they'll sit around and go, well, the state of Tennessee isn't doing anything about it.
Right.
Their welfare, their food stamp program's terrible, or whatever, and then they'll go down to Capitol Hill and get a photo op with their AstroTurf signs or whatever. You know what I mean? It's but I think you're right, though, in a way that to the earlier point about the underpinnings. This we've moved from this postmodern kind of skepticism into this postmodern feelings regime.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that seems about right to me. With a strong sense that science is what's going to help us maximize the feelings, right? And along with some exercise of government power. That those things with some rational planning by, following Fauci, following the science, right? And then we can maximize those good sentiments, right? And minimize the bad ones. It only takes a few minutes of reflection to know that, of course, that's bad, even in your own life, right? So that's why I also think this is kind of maybe the morality that a large part of society is intended to have, but surely not everybody in society could possibly think that way, right?
Well, they may think that way, but I don't know. It's kind of like the wall. Everyone was aghast at the idea we put a wall up between Mexico and America. And then you had the classic kind of retort, which is like, well, you got walls in your house. Sure. You're posting on Nextdoor, that some guy was like standing in front of your house for a little too long or something.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Sure.
There's a great clip, a great stand-up bit by a guy named Sebastian Maniscalco. And he talks about growing up in an Italian family where like people would just stop by the house and be like, "Hey," and they'd be like, come in for dinner. Like, it's time, get the wine out. And now when people knock on your door, it's like SEAL Team 6, like, who's here? You know what I'm saying?
When you look through my doorbell camera.
Yeah, let me lay in my bed and look through my doorbell camera and then not answer the door. And then maybe call non-emergency, because you don't want to get, a transient person involved with, a justice. Sure. You don't want to turn a transient person into a justice-involved individual, as they now say, for felons.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what's going on. That is what's going on. And whatever the philosophical underpinnings of it are, it's the postmodernism idea of like, let my feelings dictate. But I think this is all following a breakdown of the family unit as the primary foundation of civilization. I just think that that's what's going on.
Yeah,
and
I think you're right.
I mean, it just flows. It just flows. It flows down.
Yeah, I think and we'll close with this. I think a lot of the ideas we've talked about are an important part of what's going on. My current phrasing for this is something like Dionysian Enlightenment, right? Which sounds really awful and weird, but but I also think those ideas play a role, right? But I do think there are
100%.
But I think I think you're right that there are structural underpinnings, right? And something I will always give a nod here to both Marx and Machiavelli on, but this is also, I would say, present in Aristotle, is, sometimes, those of us sort of in the kind of classical worldview, Christian worldview kind of position, only think about it in terms of ideas, right? And don't look at structures and incentives, right? And structures and incentives are actually really, really important, right? And one of the things that's Machiavelli in one way brings this up: structures, incentives, and sort of, I would get kind of really basic human motivations, right, are at play as much as ideas and philosophical constructions. Again, I tend to think that they're sort of interconnected, right, and that they sort of play off of each other, right? But at the same time, I do think the structures are key. If we had structures and incentives that undergirded the natural family, right, a lot of these problems would just dissolve, right?
100%.
I think, even just say something simple like technological, like if the pill had never been invented, a lot of these problems wouldn't have even emerged. Chastity has a sort of practical force to it when, coitus interruptus and condoms are your only way of avoiding pregnancy, right? You know what I'm saying, right? Damn, chastity doesn't sound so bad.
Yeah, it's practical, and in this case, maybe we can do another episode on technology. I just think that so you're right. even so when we talk about structures, some people might recoil and be like, oh wow, they're talking about like structural racism or whatever.
Mhm.
Okay. I'm talking about like the literal structure of like the neighborhood.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
If you're sitting in the, like everyone moves out of the cities, they all get telephones,
Mhm.
have this kind of holdover family Christmas time ethos, right?
Sure.
That's gone.
Yeah.
It's SEAL
Right.
Team 6 when someone knocks on your door.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like if someone knocked on my door, I don't freak out. I'm like, who is it? I hope it's a Jehovah's Witness so I can talk to them. Now that's my personality.
Sure. Sure.
But if someone's knocking on the door, my wife's at home, she's getting a little antsy
Sure.
because like we are atomized in our own neighborhood. We're surrounded by
Sure.
people who are hostile to us.
Yeah.
We're not in close proximity to people we agree
Mhm.
with and that we know and all that, because I live in a liberal neighborhood in the urban core.
Mhm.
And we go to mass, and we know our mass people, and we love
Mhm.
them, and we love our Protestant friends from college and all that. But hey, 17% of Catholics go to mass every week.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And half of
Sure.
them think, or a
Sure.
third of them think the Eucharist is real, or whatever the
Mhm.
abysmal numbers are from out of Georgetown. So these talk about structures. When the church, because the church, everyone's like, oh, I love medieval Europe. I love going there. Not medieval. I love going to Europe. It's so
Mhm.
beautiful. We need
Yeah.
walkable cities here in America, just like Europe.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well.
You need drunk Germans to build your cathedral, and then have everything fan out from that cathedral in a kind of hobnob, like just cobbled together
Sure.
structure. So they're like, well,
Right.
this structural imbalance with the suburbs in America, sure.
Yeah.
But if the telos of all these things, so universal health care, how homelessness solutions, yada yada. If you do a living wage, fair
Mhm.
wages, that's
Right.
rerum novarum. But
Sure.
like that doesn't. Pope Leo the 11th or the
13th.
12th or 13th? He
Mhm.
wasn't envisioning
Yeah.
McDonald's, okay, as being
Right.
that. Remember
Mhm.
Fight for 15? Well, the government already inflated it. Now it's you don't have to fight for 15. You're
Right.
fighting for your life if you're making $15 an hour.
Right. Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
they just divorce all these things from the natural telos, the end, which
Mhm.
is human flourishing, getting people to heaven, having a
Right.
reasonable amount of happiness in this life,
Sure.
ameliorating suffering, but mostly as a work of mercy, not
Mhm.
as an end goal for your life,
Sure. That's right. Right.
right?
That's right. Yeah. That
So
is
they're
an end
just
in itself.
adjusting
Yeah.
these goods. And
Mhm.
when you adjust a good, it's kind of like if you're shooting for the moon, if you can even do that. I'm just kidding. All right. You're shooting for the moon, right, if you don't hit the firmament first. Okay.
Just
If you're
kidding.
shoot
Just kidding.
just kidding. All right. If you're shooting for the moon and you're off by 3 degrees, you're
Mhm.
not going to hit the moon. And
Mhm.
if you're shooting for human flourishing and you're off by 2 degrees, you might not hit it. And then if you're
Mhm.
powering through and you're like, you've shot past the moon and you're in the void, the vacuum of space, and you're like, no, no, just a little bit longer.
Mhm.
Hey,
Mhm.
no mutiny. In fact,
Right.
you guys are going to stay put right here. Do not touch the controls. We're not going back. I mean, that's
That's
just
right.
what's happening,
That's right.
right? Because
That's right.
everyone's aiming towards the good.
Uh,
Like how our brains are set up. It's how God designed us, is to
sure.
seek the good. And
Mhm.
so they're wrong about the goods, and they're
Right.
continuing on the course, and they're keeping people from mutinying. And we're all
Mhm.
just like, hey, I'm going to go to the chapel. You haven't shut that off yet. I'm just going to go back there and like try to get you to turn around, and maybe I'll
That's
get
right.
elected as the captain someday or whatever. Or maybe we will mutiny. I
That's
mean,
right.
that's how I see all this, where
That's
it's
right.
like,
That's
hey,
right.
like you guys are talking weird.
Uh,
Uh, anyway,
the off-target moonshot. I think we'll leave it
the
at
off
that, Whit. I
target
like it.
moonshot.
That's good.
Just
That's good.
saying.
That's good. Well, I hope our listeners and friends enjoyed our conversation. Whit, I enjoyed it a lot. I think a lot to think about there, a lot to
Yeah.
reflect on. I think if to sort of wrap up on a positive note, as misshapen as all of this is, as off target as it is, We do actually know the goods. The goods are pretty basic. They're pretty fundamental. We can't fix the world on our own, obviously. And we do want and need a decent society around us. But the best we can do, of course, is, pray, raise our families, have good friends, do the good things in ourselves, raise our kids well, worship
and
God.
Be bold.
Be bold too. Yeah, I agree.
Because because I had a realization last year. I was just really like spooled up watching a lot of fear content. I don't know if I could say what I would say. I don't know. Fear content online, and like, oh my gosh, like, this is just doom scrolling, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this is so crazy. Then I watched Matt Walsh's "What Is a Woman" documentary, right. and I was watching it, and I wasn't like, yeah, look at these idiots. I was like, these people have no cogent arguments.
Right. Yeah.
They don't have the truth. They are not operating on a framework of truth. And so I was like, wait a minute. Because I think a lot of times people who of faith, people who are watching this, were going, hey, everything's crazy. Like, I'm scared.
Right.
And of course you can get canceled and like lose your job. And that's a serious consideration. But as far as like interpersonally, yeah, you're right. Find our vocations and do them to the best of our abilities with God's grace. That's first and foremost.
Sure.
And secondly, be bold.
Yeah.
And just know that when you're talking to somebody who is advocating for any of these very squirrely, demonic ideas, in conversation, if you ever or you're talking to someone who's getting into these ideas, or like, you're at Thanksgiving and you're the cousin comes into town and she's at Middleton MTSU, and she's like, well, actually, you go, I don't think so. I don't think that's true. Other people normally just going, oh, okay, weird. That's that lady, and then they get in the car and they're like, she's off the rails. Can you believe that? I don't know.
And the thing is, even when you do that, sort of like have to be bold, right? You don't have to be a jerk. You can say, Darlene, bless your heart, I just disagree with you.
I'm only a jerk online, Dr. Smith. I'm only a jerk online.
That's very relaxed, right?
I'm just saying, like, they don't know. They don't know. That's right, and instructing the ignorant is a work of mercy.
Sure.
And there's the harvest is plenty and the laborers are few, and there's ample opportunity to do that. And the people who are watching this are equipping themselves to do that.
Yes.
And so I encourage all the listeners and viewers, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have the kind of extrovert personality like I do to be bold. It can be as simple as you're on your lunch break and someone brings something up, and instead of just being like, that's crazy, I know the world's going crazy, you can say something blunt and go like, it's evil.
Right. Yeah.
And if they're like, what's that? You're like, it's a deprivation of the good.
That's right.
It's something that ought not be.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
good.
Well, hey, I really appreciate you having me on here. It was a pleasure. I'm normally not at full strength at 8:30 in the morning, but I was able to rally and
Jesus gave us coffee.
It's hey, I'm Mormon, man. No caffeine for like 3 years now.
Woo, man!
I'm telling you,
that's serious.
Now nicotine.
I got you. Well, friends, thanks so much for listening and participating. Whit, thanks so much. Please be sure to like the video and share it with others. Also, I'll put a link in the description below for this. But we do now have our Patreon site up. So those who would like to support our work using Patreon can do so. We'd really appreciate that. And until next time, God bless.